name's Kedavan. Welcome back to my channel. It has been a while. In March and February combined, I was sick 4 times and took 2 trips, so I had basically no free time to do anything, including film, but I'm back. I thought that a really good welcome back video would be a kind of like monthly wrap-up, but since I'm terrible about monthly wrap-ups, partially because I don't like filming them, and partially because I can never get the timing right, I decided like, okay, maybe this would actually be a good time to do it because it's the beginning of April. And then I decided, why not do my favorites of the whole year? So for the past 3 months, all the books I've read, and I'm basically gonna give you like the top 25% of them. And then I realized that like almost all of them that I wanted to talk about were feminist in some way. So then I just decided to turn this into my favorite feminist reads of 2023. That's probably what the video is gonna be called, I don't know. So we're just gonna get going really quickly, and the first one on my list is King Kong Theory by Virginie Despentes, and this is a French feminist classic, or maybe, is it old enough to be an official classic yet? I don't think so. It was originally written, I believe in 2006 or so, and this one is translated by Wynne. So yeah, this one is sort of like a, I guess you could call it a collection of essays, but it's really just kind of like one long essay, broken up into bits, and basically she goes into her theory, the King Kong theory, which is, you know, I can't really explain, I can't sum it up too easily because she goes through a lot of different ideas, but this is one of the few nonfiction books that I have read and actively disagreed with parts of it and still given it 5 stars. So that's why it's #1 on the list. Well, no, it's the #1 of this section, which is like nonfiction books, because it's really just meant to be thought-provoking. It's not like a Bible of how to be a feminist or, you know, any specific like thing. It's just her like kind of rage against the patriarchy in, at the time, I think it was more of a fresh take. Now it's a little bit dated in various ways, and those are the parts I mostly disagreed with. But anyway, this is definitely a must read, and it's really well written and it's really quick. I read it in a couple days in hard copy, so that's rare for me, as you might know. Next up is Against White Feminism by Rafia Zakaria. This one and the last one I both read for my feminist book club, and they were both great, but this one I think is more updated, more timely, more maybe applicable to like our lives today. I think it's great. It's a really interesting mix of memoir and I'll just say truth telling, because it's not like she has statistics to back this up. You can't really like statistically prove white feminism. I mean, maybe you could, but it's not about like the numbers. It's just about like the philosophical like push behind it and the prioritization and all that stuff. So this one is really well done, and I think more important to read in today's climate, especially if you're feminist. I would like to say that this is readable for non-feminists, but I actually don't think so. I think you kind of need to at least identify a bit as a feminist before you can like wade into this, but good like 201 or 301 kind of reading. Alrighty, and then we have Feminist Queer Crip by Alison Kafer. I picked this up, oh my gosh, like from a person on Facebook. I randomly purchased it for like a long time ago just because the title intrigued me, and then when I actually like looked it up, I was like, oh, this is considered like a seminal text in feminism and Crip theory. So cool, and so I finally got to read it earlier this year. It is excellent. Feminist Queer Crip. So this is basically a work exploring the intersections of feminism, queerness, and Crip theory, which is, I would say, a subset of disability studies, I suppose. I think a pretty large part at this point, but, and it's super fantastic. I don't even know how to like summarize something as this. It's so foundational and important. So I don't know if it's the best chapter in the book, but the one that stuck with me the most is At the Same Time, Out of Time, Ashley X. And so Ashley X is the name of a young woman who was sterilized because her parents thought it would make their lives easier. It was a very like hotly debated topic at the time, and initially you can get outraged about the story, you know, like there was nothing wrong with her reproductive organs, they just basically didn't want to deal with her period, essentially. And so that idea of like, oh, well, she's never going to reproduce anyway, so she doesn't need to, a bit of assumptive, you know, statement, and also the discussion of how time and like the possibilities and futureness of the situation was explored so well, and it's just like, it's full of these little like what I would call like disability study vignettes that she, you know, explains like the basics of whatever like controversy or topic or story that she's using, and then it like explodes into this like fantastic chapter or section about the concepts that she's trying to apply to those situations, and this situation just illustrates her theory. Highly recommend, cannot recommend it enough. Available on Scribd, narrated by the author, super excellent. And now we have Finding the Mother Tree, Discovering the Wisdom of the Forest by Suzanne Simard. So my partner bought this for me because I had it on hold at the library and just kept delaying it, and I was like, oh, I don't really feel like reading it, and I thought, oh, maybe if I own it, like, that'll make me read it. It didn't, because I got that I think in like end of September, and I didn't read it until just a few days ago, but it is a super fantastic book. I knew I just needed to read it and I would enjoy it, so I'm here to confirm it was actually good. The thing is, I think though my expectations were a little high because I have already read Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer, and it's a similar format, like memoir, mother, woman in science, and then melding that with like the scientific thing that woman is studying. And I really did resonate a lot. She has a lot of issues with sexism in science as a scientist, because she's a I don't even know what they call them, a forest scientist. Like, she has a degree in forest science. That there's no ology behind it, but essentially she's in the Forest Service, and that's like a very male-dominated field. It's very rugged, outdoorsy, like manly man kind of science. And the main thing that she sort of figured out was that trees know each other, and they take care of each other, and through their root system and the fungus that grows on their root system underground, they're able to pass nutrients and resources back and forth to one another. That towards the end of the book, she explores how trees are aware of who is biologically related to them. So if you plant, you know, 3 trees together, and you have a mother tree and a baby tree that is a descendant of that mother tree, and a tree of that same species that is not a descendant of the mother tree, that mother tree will give its descendant or kin more nutrients. So they have these kin networks that now are scientifically demonstrable. And so that's sort of how her career has led to, and now she's currently working on like I think a bigger scale mother tree experiment. So it was a very good book, very easy to read, not too dense on the science, and it was just really fun. And then this one, so those were the nonfiction books, and then this is kind of nonfiction, but it's a BD. I got this from the library. It was just published, I think, a couple months ago. It has like the new sticker from the library, and it's called Queenie, Godmother of Harlem, and it's illustrated and written both by Elizabeth Colomba and Aurélie Levy. It was originally in French, and it was translated by who? I don't know, maybe them, I'm not sure. This basically is a BD slash biography of what's her name, Stephanie St. Clair. Yeah, Stephanie St. Clair. She was one of the original mobsters of Harlem. So if you've watched The Godfather or are at all aware of the Italian mob, things like that, she was one of the main mobsters, i.e. competition. So this is a little bit about her life. It's sort of interspersed with her backstory and also her current life in New York. She is a French-speaking woman, black woman from Martinique, and she came to the US when she was very young and just decided she is going to make it here. And, you know, I suggested to my partner, and he was like, does she do bad things? And I was like, yes, she does do a lot of bad things, but she also had a very bad life. So not that it excuses, you know, bad behavior or anything, but I mean, I'm not about to hold her to a higher standard than like Italian mob bosses, because they basically do the same exact kind of thing. I'll flip it open so you can kind of get a taste of the art. It's black and white. It's kind of simple, but I really enjoyed it. And so that's Queenie, Godmother of Harlem. And now we move on to the short stories. So first we have Break It Down by Lydia Davis. So this book, I just love Lydia Davis. Like, I don't know, if you haven't read Lydia Davis, you need to. Her short stories are often very short. Like, for example, this whole thing, not this page, is one short story. It's a very quick read. They're very punchy, very impactful, often exploring feminist themes. I really love it. I can't wait to read another collection by her. I think now there's actually a compendium with every short story she's ever written. So if you want to go out and buy that, I think it's an investment you won't regret. So Lydia Davis, definitely. So next up we have Intimacies by Lucy Caldwell. She is a Northern Irish writer. This is just such a beautiful insight into women's lives and the little details. I think the very first story is the one that I will never forget. So it's basically about this woman in a cafe, and she has a toddler and an infant in a stroller, and she needs to take the toddler to the bathroom, and this woman offers to watch her baby while she takes the toddler into the bathroom, and then she comes back and the baby's gone. And I won't tell you how the story ends, but just like, it's more about like her thought process of like, oh my God, like, did I just lose my baby? Did this woman just kidnap my baby? Like, she's basically freaking out, as you would. It just is gripping, and I think I'll never forget that story, because I think even if you're not a mom, like if you're responsible for a child and you like thought it was there, and like, you know, they're having fun over there and then all of a sudden they're not there, it's like, is this it? Is this the you know 0.01% time that a baby got kidnapped and it's my fault and I let it happen? So that like terror is just like so universal, and I'm sure mothers resonate a lot more with that, but I resonated as a childcare provider for sure. All right, next up is Lucky Breaks by Yvegenia Belorusets, and this is a Ukrainian author, but she writes in Russian, and it's translated by Eugene Oshtasvesky. And so she is, I don't know if she's actually from the Donbass region, but these stories are all short stories about women living ordinary lives in the Donbass region, which, if you don't know, is the region of Ukraine that's actually been at war with Russia since 2015. So this is, the current situation in Ukraine is basically nothing new to these characters and obviously the real life people. And she's actually not a writer primarily. Primarily she is a photographer, and so the book has lots of photographs that she's taken in it, which I really appreciate, just to kind of give you a taste of what it is actually like in this region. A lot of them, I have at least like six or seven stories like thumbed down in this. I really enjoyed it. I can't recommend it enough. If it's not about the current crisis or war in Ukraine, but it's very similar. You know, a lot of internal displacement, a lot of economic insecurity, all these things that are affecting the people today had affected the people in this region years ago, and these stories are a really amazing reflection of that. So now we move into the novels. There's actually only 4 novels in this whole list, but the first one I actually read very recently. It's called Who Among Us by Mario Benedetti, and I read this for Invisible Cities, the Uruguay one, I think was last month, and I read it last month, so it's like the only thing I've done on time this month, or this year rather. I loved it. I didn't even really realize that it's kind of a little bit polyamorous tinged. It's not at all, like there's no polyamory at all, but it's basically about these 3 characters, Miguel and Alicia. They fall in love, they're dating as teenagers, and Miguel's best friend Lucas arrives, and all of a sudden Lucas and Alicia, I suppose it's Alicia. But anyway, they have this energy between them. They're always arguing. They're having these really deep conversations. They're super like engaged with one another. And Miguel feels like his relationship with Alicia is super flat in comparison and not as exciting in comparison. So he sort of talks himself out of the relationship before it's even really begun, because they're just teenagers. To his shock, she agrees to marry him, and then 11 years later the relationship finally falls apart, mostly because you can see from how he writes about it, he decided it was over before they even got married. He was like, oh, I'm just second fiddle, you know, like whatever, I'm not worth it, she doesn't really want to be with me, kind of thing. But then 11 years later she ends up leaving him for Lucas, and he's like, see, I was right. Yeah, and then I can't really say what happens after that because it's not actually on the back, but I'll just read out the part that says, as each member of this strange love triangle tells their side of what happened, an unforgettable story of desire, deception, and tragic misunderstanding unfolds. So basically, Miguel is not right. His perspective is not actually accurate of what happened. It's just his perspective, and his perspective basically tanks everything unbeknownst to him. So Really recommend this one. It's less than 100 pages too. It's like super, super tiny. And then we have one I got from the library, so I'll just pop it here. It's called Diary of a Void by Yagi, and that's a Japanese author, and I don't have the translator's name, so I'll put it here in editing. But I watched, I think it was like a Women at Work video by Natalie from Curious Reader, and I just, you know, took all those books on her list and just like put in holds at the library just so that they would kind of pop up randomly, and then this one popped up and I was like, oh sure, I'll read it. It was very short, very interesting premise. So it's about this woman, Japanese woman, who works in an office that's very male dominated, and she's like always the one that's told to like clean up the coffee and organize things and do like very domestic womanly tasks. And one day she's just like, oh, sorry, I can't clean up the coffee because I'm pregnant and it makes me nauseous. And she's not pregnant, but she like goes through the whole thing pretending to be pregnant and like lying. And it's kind of like a bit magical realism because like she somehow also tricks the doctor and she gets like maternity leave. It's not meant to be like, you know, very like realism. There's definitely like some mystery, magical realism like interwoven, which I really appreciated. It made it a bit more fun, I think, to read. But anyway, it's definitely like a super, super interesting novel. Highly recommend that one. And then the next one, actually, I bought a copy, but it hasn't arrived yet, or it's sitting at my gardien or my concierge, and I just haven't picked up the package yet. But it's called Didn't Nobody Give a Shit About Carlotta, and it's by James Hannaham is cis as far as I know, but he's written a novel about a black woman a trans woman who went into prison as a man in the 90s. During prison she transitions, and then 20 years later she is released on parole, and it's sort of like modern retelling of Odysseus and the Odyssey, and kind of like all her adventures outside of prison and what happens and all that good stuff. And of course it's very like sad story in the sense that like we know that as a trans woman she's obviously been abused severely in prison, because she of course stayed in the men's prison during the 90s and the early aughts. That wasn't a thing to move trans women into women's prisons, so we know she was abused. But the character Carlotta, she is so funny, so interesting, and the whole vibe of the book is very uplifting and very, can I say wholesome? Because she's like, you know, I'm gonna go ahead and say wholesome. Like, she's just a very wholesome person, and like, she's just like one of those beautiful people. You're like, oh my gosh, I'm so glad you exist on the planet. And this book is basically just her narration of everything happening in the first few days outside of prison for the first time in 20 years. So I really, really love that one. Okay, and then next up we have Line by Niall Bourke. This one's an Irish author, and I picked this up in Ireland, 2021 now at this point, and I'm so glad I finally read it. I literally read the whole thing in one day, and it's not thin. It's a pretty thick book, and it is so fantastic. Although I will say a lot of people I'm sure won't like it, but basically these people, their whole society is that everyone camps in a line, and you want to get to whatever's at the beginning of the line, but you don't know what it is, and you basically know that if you leave the line, your life is over, and going to the back of the line is the worst thing that can happen to you, blah blah blah. But then this boy who's been raised by his mother is kind of just like, I don't know about this, and he and his girlfriend are, you know, thinking about getting married, but they're not sure because she would have to drop in line to join him. Interesting. And finally his mother dies, and one day he finds a book in her things, and that book makes him think that maybe the line is all bullshit. And so he basically takes the book and his girlfriend, and he goes on this adventure to sort of figure out what is the line. If we leave the line, is it really a disaster? What's beyond the line? All these fun questions that he has, that he's always asked himself, and now he actually feels like he has the power to find out the answers. So I won't tell you obviously what happens, but you know, it's a dystopia. It obviously is like commenting on our current political situation, as all dystopias I think do. It is very on the nose. That I think is the main complaint about it. But I personally don't need my dystopias to be subtle. Like, it's not a thing, you know, like I feel like if you're trying to be too subtle, then like it's almost not a dystopia. I don't know. I read it in one day, and for me, if you know, I don't read, you know, an entire book in one day on paper, like in physical copy. I don't think I've done that since I was probably like 15. So it gripped me, let's just say that. And so this next book, we're moving back into poetry. It's sort of like an epic poem. I got it from the library, so I'll pop up a copy here. It's called Deaf Republic by Ilya Kaminsky. Ilya Kaminsky is a Ukrainian writer who has lived in the US for a very long time. And I read a collection of his poetry over 10 years ago, and I was like, oh, this is nice. Like, I just found, like, you know, like, it was like kind of like one of those, like, oh, buy it for $1 ebook kind of things. And I read the ebook and I was like, this is nice poetry, like, and just kind of never thought about it again. And then I remembered him and said, oh, like, you know, I'm looking for more Ukrainian writers. Let's see if he's done anything else. And I realized he's deaf, which if it was discussed in his other collection of poetry, I don't remember that. But he's a deaf poet. Oh, I should also say that he is a Ukrainian poet who writes poetry in English, which is why I picked up his poetry in the first place. It is very impressive to write poetry in not your native language. But anyway, so Deaf Republic is about this town, and it's kind of under siege by this like unnamed, you know, oppressors. I think we all know who they are, but they're not named in the poem. And so it's this very small fictional town, and the poem starts with, or it's a series of poems, I should say. In the first part, it starts off with a young deaf boy has been murdered by this occupying force. As a form of resistance, all of the villagers, when they're given commands by the soldiers, they pretend they're deaf. They're like, you know, like, I can't understand what you're saying. I can't obey your commands because I can't hear you. It's kind of implied that that's why the deaf boy was killed, because he couldn't hear a command and they just killed him. So the town collectively becomes deaf in solidarity and in fighting the resistance. And then we have these characters, husband and wife, and the wife is pregnant. And I won't, you know, ruin the story a bit too much, but basically it really explores motherhood and sacrifice and taking care of children as a form of resistance, and what you give up when you take care of a child. And that actually brings up, for both of these, I can't spoil it, but it's the themes of like motherhood and sacrifice for your children are very strong in both Deaf Republic and this one. So I kind of put them together on purpose so that I could say that without saying it, if that makes sense. Second to last, we have Song of Lowena and Song of Okol by Oshtasvesky. I buddy read this with Natalie from Curious Reader. We haven't finished discussing both parts, but we did discuss Song of Lowena, and that is it's an epic poem of a wife talking to her husband, and she's very frustrated that he wants the white Western things. You know, Betek is a Ugandan writer, so he's sort of like using these epic poems to describe how unhappy he is with the changes in culture and things like that. And it's written from a woman's perspective, which I found super interesting. And I personally thought the Song of Okol was much weaker in comparison, the husband replying to his wife. And it was sort of just like as a tool for Betek to sort of like say everything that the wife couldn't say, and that's fine. But Song of Lowena on its own is, I think, magnificent and a really well worth read, very short as well. So last but definitely not least is the actual first book I read of the year, and it's called If Not Winter, Fragments of Sappho, and it's a translation of Sappho's poetry by Anne Carson, and it's actually only the fragments. So a lot of Sappho's poetry is lost, there's pieces of it missing, and a lot of the times modern translators will just sort of patch it in and sort of guess what it might have said. But Anne Carson doesn't do that. She leaves the gaps, she leaves the spaces, and it's really beautiful, super simple. I originally heard about that book from Ben at Doom Antidote, and at first I was like, that's a little silly, like, because some of the poems are like 3 words and that's it. But then I thought, you know what, if I'm gonna read Sappho, I should probably read it as it was and then read the fill-in later. So I picked it up kind of on a whim and absolutely loved it. It was super beautiful, and it was a super quick read as well. So that's it for this video. Those are the top 16 books I read in January, February, and March, and they all just happen to be feminist. So I guess that gives you a little insight into my mindset so far this year. And if you've read any of the books I mentioned, do let me know what you thought of them, or if you want to read any of them now. But I really want to hear from you what your favorite reads are of the year so far, and specifically any favorite feminist reads so far this year. I really want to hear about those. So until next time, bye!